Chapter 10. Nasad gurmi, mi en ulu, mi mando adi, kando si ade, te manda yaim, mando ade. No one likes us, we don't care. We are Mandos, the elite boys, Mando boys, from Mandalore. Mandalorian drinking song, loosely translated. Said to date from a ban on Mandalorian mercenaries, drinking in local tap cafes, when employed by the government of Jaria Sisk. Republic Treasury Building, Coruscant, 478 days after Geonosis. Bessany closed the doors to her office and obscured the transparent steel walls with a touch of the button on her desk. She didn't want to be disturbed. Syntax 2. Do I concentrate on that? She fondled the blaster that Muriel had given her and wondered what it would take to make her use it. She'd never fired one in anger. She hadn't even been trained to shoot, but now seemed a pretty good time to learn. Then she began trying to work out how she might take a closer look at Syntax 2 in person, or at a distance, and work out what was going on. It was a military area, and no member of the public could stroll in there unannounced. There weren't that many excuses to pay a visit even for a treasury agent. The public accounts showed a number of contractors providing services to the Grand Army that could be cross-referenced to Syntax, and one of them, Donnet Logistics, also showed up on the health budget. It was worth a look as long as she was thinking med center. I could be totally off beam, of course. And I got Muriel his answer anyway. I should walk away from this. But she couldn't, because Ordo couldn't walk away, and neither could Kor or any of the others. She realized how empty her life must have been to have filled up so fast and so easily with people who possibly didn't give her a second thought except as a useful contact. I'm not stupid, Cal. But they had something she wanted too, and it wasn't just Ordo. She wanted a share of their closeness, that belonging and camaraderie, and an end to feeling she was on the outside of life. She thought suddenly of Fee, and how so Ordo said he knew there was a complete element missing from his existence, and he resented it. She at least knew what hers was, and where she might get it. But there was also the lure of a wrong to be righted, and she knew she wasn't alone in that. Senator Skeena from Chandrila was getting very vocal about the Grand Army's conditions and clone rights. He might prove to be a handy excuse for investigating further. Her private comlink stared back at her from the palm of her hand, daring her to choose between calling Ordo and contacting the senator. Still scared that she might call while Ordo was gambling whether to cut a red wire or a blue one as a detonator counted down, she sent him a delayed message instead. He could choose when and if he wanted to read it. I hope you enjoyed the cake. What else could she say? She had no idea who else might see it, secure link or not. You have to try my home cooking when you get back. She could imagine Ordo reading it with a frown, taking it at face value, while Muriel, who seemed to be leading a totally different life, and relishing it, would have given her a knowing grin. Bessany sent the message with a click of her thumbnail on the keys, then tapped in the code for the Senate switchboard. No point leaving an audit trail on the office link just in case. He's a known anti-war activist. They'll be watching him, whoever they might be. Senator Skeena's administrative droid made an appointment for her to meet him later that day, which indicated just how few lobbyists were courting a man who opposed the war, and asked if she preferred off-site. I'm at the Treasury Building, she said. Visiting the Senate was routine for a government employee. It would draw less attention than a meeting in a tap cafe or restaurant. She'd be picked up on any of a dozen security holocams as she moved around Galactic City, and even by the surveillance satellites that kept watch over Coruscant. I'll come to his office. On the way to the meeting, sitting in the back of an air taxi, she felt that the small blaster in her pocket was visible to the whole planet. She didn't even know what type it was. It was a smart dark blue with a stubby green-gray barrel and a little red light that showed it was charged. Quite a pretty object. When she peered at the engraved plate on the butt, she was sure the end of the grip was called that. She could see the words, Mercen. Lady, you're making me nervous, said the taxi driver. You going to assassinate someone? Bessany hadn't realized he could see that far over the back of the seat, But there was a lot she didn't know about the visual field of a Rhodian's faceted eyes. She slid the blaster off her lap and back into her pocket. "I mix with unsavory characters," she said. Taxi drivers had an opinion on everything. Senate's full of them. They're called politicians. She thought that way too, but then realized she'd never actually met one socially. Where did she get that idea? From the holonews? From the courts? The power of stereotypes was astonishing. She wondered how she could ever gain any headway in making Coruscanti see the anonymous troopers fighting the war for them as living, breathing men. She couldn't even say they were all someone's son or husband or father or brother. They were utterly outside of society. The size of the task almost crushed her. "One step at a time, girl. Do what you can." Senator Skeena met her in one of the cell-like private interview rooms kept for senators to meet members of the public. He was much more ordinary than she'd imagined, not terribly well-dressed, but he had an earnest passion that hit her like a tidal wave. Another stereotype crashed and burned. "Of course I'm concerned about what happens to these men," he said. "Whatever other member planets might do, Coruscant hasn't tolerated slavery in millennia. It's intolerable that we adopt it now simply because it's expedient. But I'm a lone voice." Bessany took it carefully. "I'm having some difficulty identifying medical provision for the Grand Army, Senator. I can identify expenditure on what I think are med center facilities, but it's not... Let's say the audit trail isn't transparent." That careful comment meant a great deal in political code if the listener wanted to interpret it. Skeena seemed to. "Yes, I've asked repeatedly about casualties. The medical field units are woefully inadequate, and I can't find out what happens to those killed in action. To the best of my knowledge, the bodies aren't recovered. There's no hero's return for these poor men. So if you see large sums allocated to clone welfare, I can assure you there's no sign of it being used to that end." Bessany had a sensation of dread like cold water spilling in her lap. It was something she could have found out easily enough from Ordo. He'd know what they did with bodies, but it was one of a long list of things she'd never thought to ask. The inference was that troopers were simply discarded like waste, and that stoked her anger. She hovered on the edge of asking Skeena if he knew anything about facilities on Centax II, and decided that it was too dangerous to have that kind of discussion with a man she didn't know. "I audit some of the Grand Army accounts," she said. That much was true, and hardly a secret if news of her meeting got back to her bosses. She slipped a plastoid contact card from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "If there's ever anything you think I should look at, discreetly, of course, because I'd be investigating other public servants, do let me know." "Ah, you're the internal police." "I look after the taxpayers' credits. And here was I thinking, you might be concerned about the welfare of our army." Bessany bit her tongue out of habit, but it was too painful a comment to let pass. "Oh, but I am," she said. "They're not just theoretical charity cases to me. I'm dating a trooper." Skeena looked taken aback for a moment, and she wasn't sure if he was reacting to her cutting comment or the unsolicited personal detail. "Well," he said, "there's no point my haranguing you about the fact that they're all human men like any other, is there?" It was time for a little humility. "I know a lot of clones by most people's standards, and yes, I care what happens to them." "You might know then what happens to them." "In what sense?" "When they're wounded but can't return to active duty. You see, I can find out what happens on the Rimsu medical stations, or at least I get some limited answers from the defense staff, but I'm getting no answers about the men who can't be patched up and sent back." Bessany thought of Kor, temporarily assigned desk duties after a device he was defusing blew up, and took his hands with it. He was awaiting the arrival of specialist prosthetics, and if Skirata hadn't grabbed him for Commando training, he'd have gone back to ordnance disposal. "I would imagine they die," Bessany said. "The army seems to go to a lot of trouble to send them back." "Ah, but life isn't that tidy," Skeena said. He lowered his voice, even though the doors were shut. "There'll be injuries that a man can survive, but that means he'll never be fit for service again. I can't seriously believe something like that hasn't happened in more than a year of this war. And yet there are no homes for these men, who must surely exist, and we know they don't end up being cared for by family, because they have none. So where do they go? Bessany didn't even want to think about it, but she had to. The only answer she could think of right then was that the most badly injured who might otherwise have been saved were left to die. But some mobile surgical units had Jedi advisors. No Jedi would let such a thing happen, would they? She had to talk to Jusik. He'd tell her. "I'm going to see if I can find out," Bessany said, "and I'm going to carry on pressing for proper long-term care facilities." Skeena looked troubled. "Meanwhile, I'm also going to help raise funds for charitable care. There are some citizens out there who want to help, you know." "I'll keep you posted," Bessany promised. She took the long walk back to the Treasury building, pausing for a caf on the way, and found that the senator's question was now eating away at her. Yes, it could only mean that clone troopers lived or died. There was no middle way or disability provision. The war hadn't reached the 18-month mark yet. Governments were always poor at thinking things through, especially when wars caught them on the hop. Maybe this was what Donut Logistics was doing then. Care facilities out of the public eye to hide the signs that the war might not be going as well or as cleanly as the civilian citizens imagined, just as she'd first thought. She decided to check out their other projects when she got back to her desk, but while she sipped her caf, she checked them out via her datapad simply to get a street address from the directory. And that was where things started to get interesting. There was no entry in the public database for Donut. It could have been a subsidiary of another company, of course, or even one that wasn't based on Coruscant. But either way, it would have to be registered to tender for government contracts, and it would have had to register for corporate taxation even if it was off-world, and so it would require a tax exemption number. Yilka could come in useful now. She was the tax officer. She was an expert in finding companies that earned revenue and didn't pay their taxes in full. Bessany Wanan, who'd played things by the book all her life until she fell in with a crowd of misfits and men who didn't exist, put on her best liar's face and prepared to spin a plausible story to Jilka, crossing the line from merely accessing records for unauthorized reasons to entering a world of deception, with consequences she knew she could never imagine. Rebel Camp, near Aat Gafar, 478 days after Geonosis. The Marats were scuttling everywhere in a state of excitement, and there were a lot more of them today than Darman had seen before. He leaned against the doorway of the hut, brushing his teeth, collapsible plastoid bowl in one hand, as he contemplated what was going to be a busy few days. "Shift it, Dar." Niner was in full armor. He'd had word then. They were going in. 35th's moving. They're finishing up on Kilura. Let's make sure they've got an open door. Kilura. Darman spat foam into the bowl. "Have I got time to call it Tane?" "Do you have to?" "Well, I might get killed and—" Niner's expression was hidden behind his visor, but Darman knew every nuance of his breathing by now, every faint sound that indicated swallowing or licked lips, every click of the jaw when words didn't emerge. "You'll be fine," Niner said at last and slapped him on the shoulder. He was playing the reassuring Rusalor, the sergeant. The word was derived from Runs, a rock, and it summed up his solidly pivotal role pretty well. "But call her anyway. Say hi from me." Niner walked away toward the Marats. He never talked much about what he wanted from life. He never confided in his brothers about fears and loneliness, or talked about girls, or showed any sign that he didn't think the war was a good idea. It was the last bit that worried Darman most. Niner probably kept his yearnings to himself for the sake of maintaining morale. Did he think they didn't know that? But everyone griped about the war and every aspect of it out of habit and custom. It was the only leeway clone troopers had to express opinions that the command was clueless, that the food was garbage, that the kit was OSIC, and that it was all a waste of time. But it was better than being a civilian. And it was a veneer, a kind of bonding ritual to show how much you didn't care, when in reality you were scared witless, always hungry, and usually disoriented. Being the best army in the galaxy didn't stop any of those feelings. At first, Darman, like all of them, had thought their role in life was noble and inevitable. Now the indoctrination had been worn thin by seeing the galaxy beyond Commando, and even some ARCs were deserting. The rank and file were grumbling in private. If they'd had somewhere to go and the bonds had been weaker, Darman suspected a lot more would have vanished from the ranks. But they stayed for their brothers. They stayed because their only source of self-esteem was being the best at what they did. And they had nowhere else to go. Once more of them worked out what happened to those who couldn't or wouldn't fight any longer. What would happen? Yes, the GAR might have been better off with tinnies. They never worked things out. "How many teeth have you got, Dar?" Niner yelled. He'd stopped to look back. Darman paused with the brush still in his mouth. "Because you're taking an awful long time cleaning them." Darman mumbled through a mouthful of foam. "Sorry, Sarge." He went back to the refreshers to rinse his mouth and clean up, then changed from his fatigues into his bodysuit before washing the clothing in the refreshers basin with a rock-hard lump of the local soap and shaking it out so that it dried in minutes. Habit ritual was a soothing thing. By the time he'd attached his armor plates to the bodysuit, the fatigues were dry, and he could fold them tightly into a small roll that he slipped into his backpack. He couldn't even recall putting on his plates. His mind was on Etain. He shut the door and calmed her. She took some time to answer. He was on the point of just recording a message when he heard her voice, and he felt instantly foolish, tearful, and excited. It was audio only, no hollow projection, but he never questioned that because she was on deployment and she had her reasons for not showing him where she was. He worried anyway. He wanted to see her again, quite literally. He was worried he'd forget her face. "Can you talk?" he asked. There was a brief pause. "Are you okay, Dar?" "I'm fine. I got bitten by an ARC trooper." "That's gross. Are they poisonous?" She seemed to think he was joking. Darman wondered whether to blurt out that Saul had been under a death sentence, but decided that kind of thing needed saying in person. "It's okay. I just sucked out the venom and shot him. Anyway, Fee wanted his armor. Hey, I miss you. What's happening on Kilura?" Another pause. "It's not good. Most of them went quietly, but some dug in and... well, you know... casualties. Yeah. Not me, obviously." "I'm glad." He caught a note in her voice that said she was holding back. Maybe there was someone with her. The holovids showed clandestine love affairs as exciting, but Darman just found the secrecy miserable. "What's Level like?" "Solid guy. We'll be working with his battalion pretty soon. Does that mean you'll be coming back to 000? Sorry, I shouldn't ask. Just thought you'd be finished there and... It'll be a few more months. 3, maybe. Oh. Where? Why? Okay. I miss you too, Dar. Think of something you'd like to do when we meet up. I'm not good at planning things like that." Darman wasn't either. He suspected she didn't mean a drink from a grimy glass at Kibu's sleazy cantina for old time's sake. Muriel might have some ideas. He seems to know every tapcaf between Galactic City and the Outer Rim. "Okay. I don't mind as long as you're there." "Me too." Darman worried that he didn't have any smart talk or witty lines. He sounded like a total Dakut, he knew it. There was a loud rapping on the door. "Dar?" It was Fee. "Dar, are you in there?" Darman rolled his eyes and addressed the ether. "What, Fee? Are you going to be in there all day? I'm not going to dig a latrine because you're still doing your hair." Okay. Give me a moment." He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, Kyarika. I have to go. I'll call you in a while. Stay safe. I love you. Look after yourself." Darman was working up to saying that he loved her too when the link closed from her end of the channel and the moment was gone. He took a deep breath before yanking the door open, broken-hearted that he might never get the chance to tell her. He had a bad feeling about the coming assault on Aat. It was vague and nagging, probably just his growing awareness and resentment of the way things were, but possibly, just possibly an omen. Mixing with Jedi made you almost believe in that kind of stuff. "Fee, I'm going to break your Shabla neck." Fee stepped back with his hands held up in mock submission. "Steady on, Nervod. You really pick your moments. I want to use the freshers. Yeah, and I was..." Darman stopped himself. There was no point ranting at Fee for interrupting a call to attain. It would be particularly tactless. "Okay." He patted his brother's cheek with exaggerated care and realized he was doing a very Skirata-like thing. "I'm going to check the ordnance again. Ateen's been through it twice. Then I'll do it a third time." "Dar." "What?" "You can talk about Atene, you know. I'm not going to burst into tears or anything." Fee closed the door behind him, and Darman heard the sound of running water. Fee wasn't stupid, and he'd probably heard every word anyway. But Darman still felt guilty at having a part of his limited life that put any kind of barrier between them. Outside the hut, Niner and Auden were laying out equipment, checking it, and taking no notice of Aiden's spirited argument with one of the Merits. It was another dominant one with a red frill at its throat, but it wasn't Seb's. The lizards were gathering. Where there had been fewer than 100 in the camp, there were now a few thousand in the area, coming to the rendezvous point from villages scattered throughout the countryside. Darman stared at the pile of ordnance. There were enough thermal detonators to remove a large chunk of planet. "Overkill," he said. Auden looked up. "Whatever happened to P for plenty?" "You've seen Aat. They've got AAA and traffic cops, not acclimators. So we hammer them with the 35th, and then the lizards overrun them. Don't you think that's a waste of resources?" "Dar, it's still a capital city," Niner said. "And we're not just fighting the Gaftikari. We're denying the place to the Seps." "And we're not footing the bill for it either," Auden said. Darman pondered what possible use this planet would be to anyone except the mining companies. Did they even use Calirium and Norax to build droids? Maybe it was the Republic doing a favor for Shenio mining in exchange for services rendered elsewhere. The galaxy seemed to work that way. "Help us out in the war, buddy, and we too see you right when it comes to building your profits." And it didn't matter to him at all. He had no stake in it, no interest, and no consequence to him except his life and his brother's. Lives on the line, which was simply the job he did. He bent down to pick up a small thermal det and rolled it in his hands, seeing the little restaurant opposite the Aat government building. The minced roba pastry rolls washed down with sweet calf had been delicious. A charge of this size, detonated within 20 meters, would shatter the restaurant's transparasteel frontage into 1,000 blades and send them flying at 3,000 meters a second into anything and anybody within a 1,000-meter range. Sometimes it paid not to think about it too much. "Can I do the power station?" he asked. Niner didn't turn his head. "You wrecked the government buildings area. Doesn't mean I can't take out the station. I don't like changing plans this close to time." "What plans? We didn't even complete the first recce. We've scrubbed the assassinations. We're going to run the same risks." Niner didn't answer. They'd become so used to doing things on the fly with little or no planning that Darman began to wonder if they were getting sloppy. Special operations was as much more about detailed surveillance, observation, and rehearsal than going in with Deeses blazing and blowing stuff up. "Aiden's going to brief us in around an hour," Niner said at last. "Great." Darman tossed and caught the unprimed date like a toy a few times, and then laid it back on the fabric sheet with the rest of the ordnance. "I'm going for a walk." Niner could always recall him. He slipped his helmet over his head, sealed it, and strode off into the camp, seeing the world through the filter of his visor's HUD again, targets in an environment rather than beings in a landscape. Skirata said they were at the stage of life where they were making emotional connections that regular folk made much earlier in childhood, able to imagine themselves in the situations they created. But, he said, it was hard to picture yourself as the guy strolling past the restaurant at the moment the charge detonated, when you'd never done ordinary things like that, and had been given only a detached academic grasp of blast radii, overpressures, and fragment velocities. Omega Squad, like all the clone army, had been little more than highly trained, super-efficient, ultra-fit children when the war started. And it struck Darman that they were living life the wrong way around, given the maximum ability to fight, long before they had the experience to identify with beings on the sharp end of the fighting. Too late to worry about that. What am I going to do? Warn Aat. Join the Seps? Cry over dead strangers? There was nothing else he could do but fight to win, and survive to. What, exactly? The question never went away. When we win, what happens? What do soldiers like us do in peacetime? Maybe he'd end up doing refugee relief. Etain said Jedi did that sometimes. Maybe they'd still end up working together. He walked among chattering, excited Marats with jewel-like scales who didn't seem to be anxious about the coming assault. They were swarming around artillery pieces, drilling with E-webs. This was clearly something they'd been looking forward to for a long time. Darman paused to watch them, realizing his main fear was that he'd get killed before he told Etain that he loved her, and wondered where the remaining humans would fit into a society run by efficient, orderly Marats whose lives seemed to run like flowcharts. He gestured to the red-frilled boss lizard to come to him. They didn't seem to be offended by being summoned. What's going to happen when you take over? Darman asked. What's going to happen to the people in Aat? Boss Lizard did a bit of baffled head-cocking and looked as if he was calculating. There'll be roles for them in proportion to their population, of course. Darman realized he should have expected a sensible, numerical answer like that. So, no bloodletting, no purges, no species cleansing. Not for its own sake, no. What's the purpose of wanton destruction? We just want what we deserve. We are the majority. What if they refuse to fit in with that? That, said Boss Lizard, would be pointless. What are you going to change when you seize power? Nothing. Except we shall live in the cities and we shall have the majority of the elected posts according to our population. Darman could now see the mismatch between Gaftikari humans and their Marit workforce. They weren't even competing for the same thing. A nice, tidy, two-sided I want what you've got. The lizards thought differently. The two viewpoints didn't quite overlap, and the lizards were far more concerned with being proportionally represented than having power. He didn't always understand politics, and he was glad of it. This was the point at which he preferred the order to go then, and blow up that. We should have made a joint government a condition of building their cities, Boss Lizard added, almost as an afterthought. Next time, we'll remember to do that. They were born engineers, all procedure and ratios. Darman nodded and walked on, out into the heathland to the south of the settlement. Now he could see across the flat terrain for kilometers. Smoke from scattered clusters of huts in the distance threaded its way into the clear sky, and the occasional ancient speeder tracked across his field of vision, throwing up range and speed data onto his HUD. He thought of the aerial recce images of Aat, with its modest defense resources preparing for an attack, and wondered how long it would take. Where do I belong? Where as home? It sure as Shab wasn't Tapoka City. Most days he didn't even think it was Coruscant. Darman stood watching the late afternoon sun slanting across the heath, wondering what it was like to have a job where you could stop work at the end of the afternoon and do anything you liked when the audio link came to life in his helmet. Niner to Dar, RTB, Seps incoming. He activated his HUD displays, expecting to have data patched through to him. The image that rilled his field of view was a chart of the Gaftikar system, way out near the Tingle Arm so close to Kilura, close enough that it would have taken only a few hours to reach Etain, and the peppering of red points of light showed separatist vessels on a course for Gaftikar. There were a few blue lights, too, They were generated by the transponders of Republic vessels. The 3rd and 4th Battalions of the 35th Infantry embarked in Leveler, another 2 companies from the same regiment not far out of Kiluran space, and a fleet auxiliary converging on the same point at 180 degrees at sublight speeds. ETA, Darman said. Life slipped immediately into acronyms and jargon, the language of the military comlink. At those speeds, a day. What's keeping them? Officer commanding some non-clone captain called Paleon says it's brinkmanship. Back in 10. We're digging in. Surveillance sat shows Aat's bringing in fighters from outside. How many? 6. And that might not be a problem for an assault ship, but it's bad news for us. So get back here. That, at least, answered Darman's question about what use Gaftikar was to anyone. Apart from the mining corporation's interests, it was just another handy place for a fight. And they were sending in the mongrels now. Non-clones. Some of the service personnel from the fleet. Pelion. Who the shab was he? Darman wondered who the 35th's Jedi general might be. Because it wasn't Etain. She said they'd finished on Kilura. Whatever it was, wherever they were sending her, she could tell him, couldn't she? Maybe she didn't want to worry him. Of course I'm worried. I'm always worried. Ordo. Yeah, he'd ask Ordo. Ordo always obliged, always got the messages and letters through somehow. The rebel camp had taken on a different air by the time Darman got back, and he'd only been gone 30 minutes. The Marits had thinned out, and E-webs and cannons stood concealed under camo netting. He sprinted for the main building, realizing even as he made for the doors that it was so flimsy, he was better off outside. Sarge? Darman clicked through the frequencies on his helmet link. Sarge? Ops room, Niner barked. Darman entered, pulled off his helmet, and stood over the ops table, trying to get a better look at the holochart that Aiden had projected onto it. It showed the whole central region, with the scattered Marit villages and the occasional Gaftikari town, like small planets around suns. When he magnified Aat and superimposed the latest aerial reconnaissance images on it, the sudden preparations became clear. That's as of 15 minutes ago, Aiden said. Aat's boundaries were ringed with vehicles and vessels, and there was no steady procession of civilians out of the city, as was usual when attacks were expected. There was nowhere else for the Gaftikari to go. They were marooned on islands in an ocean of enemies. All they could do was dig in. You reckon they really know what's coming? Otten asked. I mean, really know? Aiden, fully armored, tilted his head as if listening to a separate helmet comlink. No, not a clue. This is them reacting to the SEPs, reacting to our inbound ships, yes? That's their only source of surveillance, said Aiden. I'm not sure who they're more worried about, us or the Marits. But they know we're coming, so I'm not prepared to risk a squad in there to prep the battlefield if we've got 2 battalions, a squadron of Torrents, and Captain Pelion's nice big cannons arriving within a day. Unless Ayat's got some hidden superweapon we failed to spot, the place is just one big target. Darman still couldn't work out why the 2 task forces couldn't simply engage in space and leave the planet alone. But taking Ayat without a bit of muscle and cannons behind them meant very messy fighting if there was no air cover to make the point. He wasn't sure which was the worse outcome for the civilians. We're not really the main game in town now, are we? Niner said. Are we going forward with the 35th? Aiden must have switched his audio feed from Leveler to the general circuit, because Darman's helmet was suddenly full of the voice traffic between vessels. They seemed more concerned with keeping an eye on the Separatist flotilla, waiting for it to power up to hyperjump. Aiden cut the link again and sat in silence, as if he was staring at the holochart lost in thought. He was waiting for instructions. Who's the Jedi in command? Darman asked. Aiden looked up. General Masmisser. Did you want to stay on the circuit? No. It's that woman of yours, isn't it? She wouldn't tell me where she was, but she's been with Levitt for some months. So yes, I want to know if she's with that flotilla and not telling me. Personal business didn't matter on the brink of a battle, but nobody argued with him. Aiden switched to another channel, head barely moving. Darman heard the slight pop as he switched, and he guessed the null was on a secure link to someone, either finding out or asking why he'd been saddled with a commando who couldn't save his private life for off-duty hours. Levitt says she's not with the 35th, and she's not in a combat zone, Aiden said, unusually kindly. So stop fussing. Darman could have called her. He had a secure link. It wasn't as if he was going to give away a position to the enemy. He dithered, trying to decide whether to slip into the refreshers and calm her discreetly, just to be sure she wasn't somewhere even worse. He just wanted to tell her. Niner, as ever, seemed to read his mind. He shoved Darman with his shoulder plate. "Go on," he said quietly. "Be quick about it, though." Darman stepped out into the corridor, opened his helmet link with a couple of blinks, and voice-activated Etaine's code. The display in his helmet told him what he could hear. No response. He carried on paging the system for a couple of minutes, telling himself she might have been taking a shower or even asleep, and then he left a message. It was hard to say the words to cold, dead air instead of to her standing in front of him. "It's me, Etika," he said. "I never told you I love you." When he closed the link, he felt embarrassed, but he'd done it, however inelegantly. If anything happened to him, at least she knew. Aiden and Niner walked out of the ops room, heads moving in a conversation that couldn't be heard outside their helmets. Fee and Otten followed. Darman's audio circuit popped again. "Change of plan, Dar," Niner's voice said in his ear. "The General wants us to play forward air control. As soon as it gets dark, we'll move up to the outskirts and recce the positions of their mobile AAA. Levitt says Leveler will be on station a couple of hours before dawn." "Lovely," said Fee. "It'll all be over in time for breakfast." The squad spent the next hour or so stripping out the rental speeder to make room for a couple of E-webs. Otten removed its ID, a transponder, and poked an assortment of probes into it to scramble the registration details. "Just in case we need to go right inside the city." He held up a small rectangle of plastoid. "We're going to have a hard job walking in dressed like this." "I still think I should go in and blow the main power station," Darman said. "If only to give us the cover of complete darkness." Aiden wandered over to them, obviously eavesdropping on their circuit. "I'll be going in to place a few EMP charges in sensitive spots around their communication centers, because we don't want them chatting to the Seps once this kicks off. All you have to do is call in the airstrikes. Okay? Once we've neutralized the big targets like their AAA and made a few holes in the infrastructure, then the Torrent Squadron can provide air support for the Marits to go in. I don't want any of you deviating from that plan." "Yeah, where are the lizards?" Fee asked, straightening up. "I thought this was their big night." "Oh, they're all here." It was almost dark now, and when Darman looked toward Aat, he couldn't see the city. In the last few nights, he'd got used to the glow from its street lighting, all the more noticeable for being set in the middle of an unlit rural location. But it was in darkness tonight. He flicked his visor through its magnification and night vision settings and still couldn't see much. Even in infrared, it was just a faint green, flattened dome of heat. "They've switched off the lighting," he said. "They're expecting air raids." "Shame that they're going to get creamed," Fee said. "It looked like such a nice place." Nobody said it, but Darman thought it. There was no reason to fight here, beyond the fact that the Republic had staked a claim by way of supporting the Marits, and so the Separatists felt they had to front up too. Darman wondered if it was treason to think that way, or just a difference of opinion on strategy. "I wonder where Sull is now," he said, but nobody answered. He glanced over his shoulder at the scrubby woodland to one side of the camp, night vision visor still in place, and thought it was malfunctioning until he realized the points of light, thousands of them, as if the display had massive interference, were actually eyes. It was the Marits. Suddenly they were an army, silent and motionless, waiting for the signal to kill. 7 kilometers south of Tropics Island, 478 days after Geonosis, Muriel stepped out of the drained-down airlock in his briefs and pulled the aquata breather from his mouth. Then he shook himself like Murd, showering water across the cargo bay, and slapped a cold, wet skull into Vao's hands. "If we're going to run DNA tests," he said, "this seems to have teeth in it." Skirata handed him a towel, and he rubbed himself down. Not a shred of meat or clothing on the thing. Whoever it was, I'm guessing that they were stripped of any identification and tied to an anchor so that the body wouldn't float to the surface, and so the local wildlife could remove soft tissue and everything else that identified him. It's a him. By the way, had a look at the pelvis. Killed first. Vao turned the skull over in his hands while Murd watched. It might have mattered. A disposal was a different crime and motivation than weighting someone down to drown. Not all humanoids drowned fast either. Or punishment. Skirata shrugged. I don't think he died of old age, so it's probably irrelevant. Muriel looked anxious for a moment, as if he'd let Skirata down simply by being unable to give him an answer. I can't tell, Calbier. No obvious fractures or marks on the bones. It's okay, son. Get dressed, 'cause we need to carry on looking. Muriel padded off, hitting the heel of his hand against his ear to shake out the last of the water. They needed proper diving suits if they were going to work outside the hull for any lengthy period. Vao put it on his list of things to acquire. I'm going to guess, he said, and you know I don't do that very often, but I bet we'll find this is the last person to see Ko Sai. What makes you say that? The Twi'lek. He delivered the equipment to whoever was piloting the barge, and if that had been a Kaminoan, he'd have noticed. Someone had to hand the stuff over, which meant seeing her, or the location. Not someone a crafty piece of work like Ko Sai would have wanted around to blow her cover. Skirata swabbed down the water on the deck. When we go ashore again, I'll see if any staff went missing. I can't see Ko Sai having a human sidekick. Well, maybe she didn't not for long anyway. Vao listened carefully and caught a faint beeping. Is that the cockpit alarm? Skirata paused and straightened up, frowning. His hearing had taken a pounding from standing too close to artillery over the years, even though he managed to hide the fact. Unless you know it isn't, why are you standing around asking the question? They made for the cockpit, but Muriel was already leaning across the pilot's seat, talking to a familiar voice on the other end of the open comm. Vao caught the word Delta just as he squeezed into the compartment. It's General Jusik, Muriel said. Delta are on their way here. Want to talk to him, Calbuir? Oh, sick. Skirata raked his fingers through his hair. What happened, Bardika? They caught up with the Twi'lek pilot. Not much I could do, but at least I stopped him from giving them too much detail. What did you do? Shoot him before he could talk? Bit of the old Jedi magic. He got as far as saying he'd told some Mandalorians about Dorama, so I suggested they'd been wearing green armor. If he'd said gold and black and... well, Delta know your armor, Cal. Skirata closed his eyes. Thanks. And I made sure he didn't get as far as giving them coordinates for the drop. But they know it's Dorama, and they've had to divert to pick up some scuba armor. I estimate you've got 10 to 12 hours, but I'm going to be there in 6. Vao cut in. To do what exactly? Not that we don't appreciate your assistance, but... You haven't found Ko Sai yet, have you? We're close, Skirata said. Well, if you haven't found her in 6 hours, I'll help you. Vao nudged Skirata in the ribs. And if we haven't found her by the time Delta get here, you keep them busy. How are they planning to insert, anyway? Land during the night and just pose as sport divers if they have to. Thanks, Bardika. They couldn't have expected Delta to be far behind. The problem with hunting for someone was that the hunt itself tended to bring debris to the surface, and even if Delta didn't quite have the Null's remarkable access to information, they'd been trained in the same techniques. Val felt a little flush of pride that his squad hadn't done so badly compared with Skirata's precious boys and all their genetic enhancements, but he decided not to rub it in. "Come on," Skirata said wearily. "More caves to ping." He settled down in the co-pilot's seat. Whatever differences Val had with him, the man had an extraordinary tenacity. The size of the task ahead was so huge, the chances so flimsy, that any sane individual would never have bothered to start. It wasn't just a matter of finding one Commando who didn't want to be found. Val wondered if she was even capable of doing what Skirata wanted. If this is all a wasted effort, how's the little Chakar going to take it? The quest, oh yes, it was a quest. A sacred calling for Skirata now seemed to sustain him. It was as powerful as religion. He was so fixed on his boys' welfare that he seemed to have no plans for himself, and his definition of who qualified as his boys was now so all-encompassing that it seemed in danger of sucking him dry. It was more than the Nulls, who had been his sons, in fact, if not in name from the day he met them. His obsession had then spread to the Commandos, and now to any stray trooper who came into his orbit, like Kor. It was as if Skirata was desperate to avoid any thought of himself, to erase himself in every waking moment. Maybe his memories were unhappier than Val knew. He seemed to be reinventing himself a day at a time, and he rarely talked about his past now, not even his father. He never talks about his mother. And apart from the knife, does he recall anything of his birth parents? Toxic things though they were, Val still found families interesting. The best thing he'd ever done was to run away from his own. As if on cue, Murd appeared at his side and clambered onto his lap, the only family he had, and maybe the best kind. "Did you ever think of asking Arcanian Micro to take a look at some clone tissue?" Val asked. "Just in case." "I did." Skirata was staring straight ahead at the shifting three-dimensional display of the sonar mapping scanner reflected onto the transparasteel viewport. "But it'll be my very last resort. Once they have a genome to play with, well, I don't want to see any more lads bred to die. What if they hadn't been Django's clones?" "What?" "Mando, I don't care about bloodlines. What if they'd been from a Corellian donor or a Quadi? Would it still tear you up to see them used?" Muriel seemed to be making a point of staying out of the conversation. Skirata sucked his teeth thoughtfully. "If I'd met them as little kids about to be exterminated, I think I'd have done the same." He looked distracted by the idea, as if he hadn't ever considered it. Being Django's blood just made it more relevant. But Django or not, they'd still have needed a sense of belonging, wouldn't they? And it would still have been my duty to give it to them, and that would have made them Mando Ade. "Interesting formations ahead," Muriel said. Val thought he might be trying to change the subject, but maybe not. "Going in for a closer look." Val looked at Muriel in profile and tried to see Django in him, but it was surprisingly hard. Odd as that might have sounded to an outsider, it was true. The clones usually didn't remind him of Django Fett at all. Part of that was living among them for years, and becoming blind to the superficiality of appearance. But there were many ways in which they didn't even look like their progenitor. Django, born of parents who lived hand-to-mouth, undernourished as a youngster, hadn't been much taller than Skirata, but the Kaminoans had man-aged the clone's nutrition carefully from the day the egg was fertilized, and they turned out tall and muscular. In 100 and more ways they weren't exact replicas of Fett, nor was his son, Boba. Poor kid. It was a terrible age to lose a father, and the boy had nobody else in his life. He was worse off than any trooper. If he managed to survive, Val predicted he'd turn into the hardest, most bitter, most messed up Shabur this side of Keldabi. Even I had a second father to adopt me. Too late, maybe, but better than never. "What's that?" Skirata said suddenly. He pointed forward. "Lots of debris." They were on the northwest quadrant of the island's shelf, and the slope on their starboard side was pocked with dark depressions that could have been caves. Strewn across the smooth seabed was a sharply delineated area of small fragments. They were visible even in the filtered sunlight, but when Muriel directed the external lamp ahead of the vessel, they stood out in sharp relief. "That's not a rockfall," he said. "If it was scree, it'd cover the whole area from the foot of the slope, because it slides. But there's a gap, about 10 meters. Rock doesn't jump, does it?" Muriel brought Ihan up 20 meters and maneuvered to a dead stop right above the debris. From the exterior holocams, the aerial view projected onto the cockpit monitor reminded Val of a bag of flour dropped on a clean floor. "Relatively recent, too," Skirata said, "or the silt would have covered it. Looks like someone dropped a load of spoil from an excavation a long time after the island was terraformed." Val actually felt excited. It was an odd hunt, but every bit as exhilarating as a chase. Meard picked up on his excitement and slid off his lap, rumbling in anticipation. "It's very tempting," Val said, "to work out a direction of travel from the shape of that spoil." The three men looked at one another. "Let's go for it," Muriel said with a big grin. They were above the 50-meter limit now, and as Ihan circled slowly above the island shelf, the sensors picked up the throb of drives and the churning sounds of propulsion units from submersibles and surface vessels exploring the turquoise shallows. The scan showed them as points of light, most of them well within the 10-kilometer safety zone. They wouldn't be disturbed down here. "I never completed the diving course," Skirata said suddenly. "I just thought you ought to know that." "Might not even need to get our feet wet, Kalbuir." Muriel took Ihan deeper, facing the submerged cliff. "Look at the 3D scan." Head on, the sonar showed a complex pattern of holes, although none of them seemed to extend far into the rock. But there was an overhang that was more or less in line with the patch of debris. Muriel skimmed the seabed, stirring silt into the clear water, and came in close to the jutting shelf of weed-coated rock. And there it was. From this angle, the scan picked up a deep tunnel, mostly hidden from casual inspection by the overhang, but now visible as a rectangular shaft with rounded corners and an aperture about 8 meters by 5. Ihan had a 20-meter beam. "Well," Skirata shrugged, "we can't just drive in, can we?" "You're so nautical," Val said. Muriel still had that grin on his face. "There's always the chance we'll find that it's only a waste outlet, and that there's a hungry thing twice the size of a Dianoga living in there. Let's find out. If Ko Sai's in there, then she'll be using transport to get in and out. Let's head back to the resort and see what they've got for rental." "This means diving, doesn't it?" "Not necessarily, Kalbuir." Whatever Muriel had in mind, it amused him. Dangerous things usually did. Val raised an eyebrow. "I'll put Meard ashore if that's okay with you." "Trust me," said Muriel. Ihan surfaced well clear of the harbor and skimmed through the gap in the breakwaters toward her berth. As they drew nearer to the pontoons and slowed almost to a stop to come alongside, Muriel pointed across the water. "That's what we need," he said. "I knew they'd have them here. Perfect." Val and Skirata followed his finger, but Val could see nothing except choppy waves. Then something broke from the surface, like a walladon breaching, and arced 3 meters into the air before crashing back into the sea again. At first, Val thought it was an enormous silver fish, but by the time it had progressed across the harbor in extravagant, corkscrewing leaps, he'd managed to focus on the thing long enough to see that it was an extraordinary ship shaped like a Faraxa shark, minus the head fin. It was 5 sleek meters long with a brilliant scarlet flash on one flank, and the words, "Wave Chaser," picked out in gold. Fearfeck, it looked like fun. Val could barely recall fun. The craft would also fit neatly through the entrance to what he hoped was Ko Sai's laboratory, as well as Ihan's cargo hatch. "Let's go rent one," Muriel said. "They're 2-seaters, and they've got a top speed of 25 kilometers an hour. Not that I researched them earlier, of course." Skirata just looked blank. It was the expression he wore when he wanted to say, "New Drar, the most vividly emphatic of Mandoa refusals," but felt he had to keep up appearances. 1. Someone has to pilot Ihan because those things won't have much range, Val said, "and I'm volunteering. I had my midlife crisis about 10 years ago, so you can go play boy racer this time, Cal." "Chabouir," Skirata muttered, but he looked nervous. The wave chasers turned out to be for sale or rent. Price had long since ceased to be an issue for any of them now that time was the rarest and most precious thing imaginable, so Skirata bought one. "Handy runabout for Ihan," he said, staring at his boots. "And if we dent the thing, we won't have any explaining to do to the rental office." Then he looked up at Muriel, a head taller than him, and slapped the pass card in the Noel's palm. "All yours, son. High time you owned something nice." Val was usually immune to Skirata's polar extremes of emotion, but for a few seconds the old Chakar and his surrogate son simply looked at each other as if there was nothing else that mattered in the galaxy, and Val felt genuine envy. It wasn't Skirata he envied. It was Muriel, for having a father who doted on him so much that he could do no wrong. Like time, it was something his wealth had never bought him.